2010. By 2012, it's up to 18%, and the most recent poll by the Pew Center put it at 19%. This is something that's just taking off in terms of people who say they have no religious affiliation at all. And who are these people that we're talking about? They're called the nuns. Have you heard this? It's always confusion. When I talk to a religion reporter, she's talking about nuns. I'm like, okay, Catholics, they're primarily, and I'm giving you the most, like Asians today. 1 out of every 3 Asians say that they have no religious affiliation in America, and it's not just in America; it's across the world. In Europe, the percentage of nuns is much higher than here, and in China, the percentage of people who say they're nuns is way over 50%. Here you saw we're getting close to 1 in 5, and that's partially because we're still a heavily Christian nation. We say, even if we don't come to church, and this is one interesting thing. When I was in graduate school, I did work for a pollster, the National Indian Research Center, and people lie about going to church. I don't know why. If you ask people if they go to church, 40% of people say, oh yeah, I was there Sunday or Saturday or whatever day you go. And it's about 18–20% actually. So, Asians, young, and I'll cover this in just a second, East Coast, West Coast, there's nuns here, but it's not like in other places. Does anyone know where the nuns are the greatest? Which state? Any guesses?
Washington, Oregon.
Yeah, that's right. Washington, Oregon. Good job, guys. Did I already teach this class? It's very interesting there. The mainline churches are struggling there. Evangelicals are growing in Oregon and Washington, and the nuns are. It tends to be educated male. It's a slightly higher percentage of males. Democrats and people who are financially secure. So what does this picture tell you? These are generally people whose lives are okay. These aren't people on 35th and North who are struggling to deal with the problems that you have to deal with. These are people who are feeling pretty good about themselves and about their lives. And here, this chart might be a little bit hard to see, but the people break down our ages by different groups now. The red is called the greatest generation, and that's for people born before 1928. And I don't think that's anybody in here, right? And then the silent generation, which is people born between, that's the yellow color, from 28 to 45. Then the boomer is this one here, the one. And then Gen X is the blue, and then this is the millennials, people born since 81. And you can actually see the same ages. These are people in their 20s, these are people in their 20s, these are people in the 20s. So you see, over time, more and more people are saying that religion doesn't really matter to them. But the funny thing is, they're saying religion doesn't really matter to them, but God still matters to them. The number of people praying in each of these categories is very similar. The number of people who believe the Bible is literally true and there are no mistakes in there whatsoever, the numbers on that have dropped incredibly. So now everybody fits into this category between 35 and 40%. And with younger people, particularly young conservatives, homosexuality is not, same-sex marriage is something that they don't care. It's something that they think we should have, but beliefs on abortion, younger people tend to be more conservative than some older people on that issue. So it's not exactly the way you would expect. So the question was, what is your religious preference? And then if you answered none, so right now it's 26%, and the assumption is it'll go up to 35–40% sometime soon.
Do you think that the people that say they have no religious affiliation fall into the people that eventually followed, the Jim Joneses, the David Koreshes, the Bhagwans? You think that those were basically people that had no religious affiliation?
I'm sure that some of the people without religious affiliations end up in that cult, but I don't think if you're in these affiliations, you're going to end up in one of those things necessarily. So, yeah, I'm sure that there's people trying to find meaning and stuff in those groups, but you can find people who are imagine, you could find a lot of former Lutherans who are sitting home right now, or at Starbucks down the road right now, doing their Sunday service. So, I mean, what did they say about Pastor Gary's favorite joke? We should all know it. There's this place, a church, where they had bats in it, and the janitor's asking, how do we get rid of the bats? And the pastor says, just confirm them. Which is funny, you know, with my kids growing up Lutheran, when they were confirmed, it was like, okay, done. And I was like, you know, I grew up in a fundamentalist church where we generally went 4 or 5 times a week, and I never felt that like I was done. And I try to have conversations with them saying that your theology, what you learned in confirmation, is good for you now, but you need to be growing, because by the time you get to be 50, it's not going to be good for you. It's not adequate to deal with the problems you have to deal with. It's not going to be adequate to deal with cancer. It's not going to be adequate to deal with divorce or all of these other problems you've learned. And it's not adequate to deal with that supersessionism. Almost everybody in confirmation learns that concept, but you know, you have to unlearn some of these things. I'm going to show you a video right now. So instead of my telling you what these people are like, I'm going to let you meet some of these people who are spiritual but not religious. And we were having problems setting this up earlier,
She calls her sacred space. I feel the universe. I feel energy. I feel mysterious forces working through my body, and I see them in other people.
Weeks is among the 46 million Americans that our poll found have no religious affiliation, almost 1 in 5. But they're not entirely secular. About a third describe themselves as spiritual but not religious.
just for comparison's sake, you heard 46 million people who are saying they don't have affiliation. How many Jews do you think America has? 50 million? 6 million. Okay. Muslims, 6 million. Lutherans were right around 12 to 15 million. So for every Lutheran, there are 3 of these people who consider themselves a nun, though they wouldn't call themselves nun.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good description. As a matter of fact, I think I say that all the time. I'm spiritual, but not really religious.
Well, I definitely don't call myself religious at all. So I would think I'm spiritual, or I believe we're all connected in some way, but I'm not religious anyway.
Kim Weeks has come a long way from the conservative Southern Methodist Church of her childhood and the religious home she grew up in.
We didn't go so far as do regular Bible readings, but we weren't that far from it. And God and Jesus were both present in our daily lives and in daily discourse.
Things began to change when she was 12. Her parents divorced, and she started questioning the church's teachings.
The flaw in the organized religion that I understand and that I was raised to believe is that the answers are too quick, they're too easy. The sort of question marks I have to put over the thesis that there was a virgin birth. I mean, just stuff like that. It's difficult for me to accept all those things and believe in something and stay contained inside of that belief based on the, frankly, veiled threat that I'm going to go to hell if I don't.
Religion scholar Diana Butler Bass has studied the growth of the spiritual but not religious. In her latest book, subtitled The End of Church, she writes that they share a deep dislike for religious institutions.
I think that the main problem that people identify with religious institutions is hypocrisy. Is that they look at these institutions and they see people who are more concerned about politics, more concerned about money, more concerned about their own power, and that's just not what people expect out of a faith institution. They expect some level of authenticity, especially in the leadership. They would like religious institutions to practice what they preach.
Butler Bass says the sex abuse scandal and cover-up in the Roman Catholic Church and the fight over the ordination of an openly gay bishop in the Episcopal Church helped accelerate a long, slow decline in religious affiliation. Despite that, Butler Bass sees in America a new spiritual awakening.
People who are in the unaffiliated categories are engaging in spiritual practices. And those run the gamut from pilgrimage to contemplative prayer to meditation and practices that connect us more fully with God. But they tend to be doing them sometimes in a congregation of faith, but more often in alternative locations.
Bathe yourself in the breath.
This meditation group in Boston is about as far from organized religion as you can get. The humanist community at Harvard is a home for non-believers, including atheists and agnostics, who do believe you don't need God to be good.
The more important question to me, though, is not whether you can be good without God, but what it means to be good in a world in which we don't have a God to tell us what to do or to help us when we need help. What it means to take care of each other, what it means to be there for one another, what it means to live an ethical life when this is the only life that we have. We're coming up with a new kind of community here to meet what is in a lot of ways a new kind of need. What's our head count right now?
Actually, I'm going to do something in just a second that I don't normally do in my classes, which is asking for your opinions. No, I usually think I put all this stuff together. Yeah, actually, here's an interesting website. This group, the spiritual but not religious, they have their own website. You can see, welcome. We're glad you're here. And they're called SBNRs, in case you guys want to refer to them that way. And you see, love is the answer, you are the question, and all religions contain some wisdom, but no one religion contains all wisdom. So the squishy stuff that I really am not a fan of. And you might remember, I did a class a couple years ago on pluralism, and my argument on pluralism is that it's not true, this argument that we got in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and more recently, that we're all ascending the mountain together and we'll reach the same point in the end. I think that religions are fundamentally different, particularly in how they see the problem of humanity. What's wrong with what's going on? If you're Jewish, it's the issue of identity. If you're Christian, it's sin. If you're Sikh, they have their own understanding of what's wrong with humanity. Every day, every time you come to church, you guys make a decision to get up, get out of bed, and come here. What is it that compels you to do that? I am interested in knowing what is it that makes you decide, because you're making a decision that 80% of the people in America decide not to do.
I come because I want to worship God in community.
Okay. Anybody else? Go ahead.
I come because music was so much of a upbringing in the Wisconsin Synod that the music is so connecting to me spiritually, connects me more to Christ.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
I feel I've been so blessed when I owe it to God to at least spend a little bit of time in purely a worship setting.
Okay. So yours is
To set it aside from all the other busyness.
Yours is communal and aesthetic, and yours is duty, right? You feel a sense of duty, responsibility. Go ahead.
I come because I need to.
Because you need to.
Yep, I really get filled up.
You mean emotionally, you feel like you need to be here. Spiritually, you need to be here.
I do.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that too, to be strengthened for all of life and for the week ahead.
So let's look at the other thing. More and more people, as you hear, that are fitting into the spiritual but not religious category, what's driving them not to make the decision to get up in the morning? What do you think it is? You heard some of the explanations they gave. Anybody have any other ideas? Okay.
It sounds like it's primarily intellectual, an argument. Reason is what's...
You know, I think of churches, and maybe next year I would like to do something on how our understanding of church is changing in some ways. That for me growing up, church was a propositional type of thing. The important thing about about church was believing the right things, or it's about ideas and beliefs. It's largely intellectual, but more and more churches, particularly mega churches and small groups, are moving toward an experiential sort of faith. So you're moving from propositional to experiential. And I would like to talk probably next year about the impact of that. Any other ideas? Go ahead.
We have friends that say that it doesn't make you a better person if you spend Sunday morning in church.
No, there are a lot of jerks at church. No, there are. I mean, some of the most unpleasant people I know.
To that point, my friends who are spiritual but not religious have greater experience of the hypocrisy than all the reasons that were named.
You like my hypocrisy.
Right. They have
Church
much
is not
stronger.
full of hypocrites, there's always room for more.
They have greater experience of that than all the things people just identified with as the reason they're compelled to come here instead of sleep in and read the paper.
Not that there's anything wrong with just to be clear. So we're now putting these things online, and another guy at work was like, "What are you doing talking about all this stuff on this YouTube video?" And I was like, "Okay, just keep on going." My 2 lives that go on. So
yeah, they think they can do it on their own without a community.
Okay. Someone else have any of that? Go ahead.
I think people who go through, there's a huge multitude of people that get college educations today. And I think one of the things that people get in college is, through their studies, is the historical church as it was in medieval times. And when I'm reading now a book called Absolute Monarchy, and basically it was. And I think they think that that's how church is today, if they've never had an opportunity to go to church as a young person.
So I sat at home, not in a corporate situation like this, and tried to come up with my own reasons. And some of them are similar to what you guys said. And one is, the church has done a number of horrible things. Not just the church, but religions have. And we're not just talking about, you're talking medieval times. All of us know about the Inquisitions and some of the stupid stuff that has happened over the years, but even our own community. I put Remember Wakeland up here. And just church scandals, and it's not just Catholics, but in New York and Brooklyn, there's a huge scandal going on with Orthodox rabbis and abuse of children there. I think that's a perfectly legitimate thing, and this is so tiny you're not going to see us, but I'll read it to you. It is Confidence in Institutions. It's a study done in 2012, and then it took the average views, and you were asked, do you have a great deal of faith or quite a lot of faith in these institutions? It's 5 categories, and they took those 2 categories and put them together, and they took the average over the last 60 years and compared it to 2012. And it's interesting, the third one throws me completely. The first one's military. People feel have more confidence in the military today than they did historically. The criminal justice system, which I don't quite get that. And the third one's the one I don't get at all, health maintenance organization. Does anyone have any experience with these things? Well, when you move down the line, newspapers, you see we're down to 25%. Big business is down, almost everybody's down. And then you get television news, public schools down from 41% down to 29%. And then you get to the church, organized religion. Historically, about 56% of us, and if you go back to the 1940s and 50s, you're up pretty high, and I'll show you that in a second. And the only 3 that have experienced it, the only other 2 organizations that have experienced bigger drops, Congress and banks. Congress, to jump to my other life, it's an interesting thing about Paul Ryan. If he decides to run for president, does he stay in an institution that's so reviled as Congress, or does he decide not to run next time? It's just a tough thing. And here it is historically from 1973. If you go on back, it gets up to close to 80%. the confidence level we have. And I told you it's either a great deal or quite a lot of confidence. And it's down up to 80%, down to 70% in the early 70s, down to 60%, 50%. And look at the drop just in this period since the year 2000. And I think we're more aware of some of the stuff that's going on, the scandals and so forth, but I think we're also aware of the hypocrisy. But this is one idea, one thing that is going on and driving people. And, you know, because a lot of these things have been going on for a long time. Is anyone familiar with the book Bowling Alone? It's a guy named Robert Putnam who was doing a study about how, you know, under Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1800s, he came here and he was amazed at the number of volunteer associations, the number of people who joined groups and did things together face to face. And he said democracy works best when we're all collectively forming, whether it's the Kiwanis or the Masons or church or anything. He was just amazed coming from Europe at the number of organizations going on. Well, in the last 30 years, the number of people who actually are involved in organizations is dropping precipitously, whether it's church, whether it's any of these things. And he used as his example bowling leagues, something near and dear to people with Middle Lumley's heart. And that is that people are still bowling. They're bowling as much as they've ever bowled, but they're not in bowling in leagues. We're all going alone. We're going with our family. And in fact, I went with my daughter to an after dance party at Bolero. I was amazed. At 2:30 in the morning, that place is completely full. But yeah, there are no. I mean, you see some leagues, but so his idea is that there's been a decline in in-person social interaction. The number of times that we're spending time with each other, doing things like this, it's dropping incredibly. So that's one thing that's happening that's different from the past. Anybody have any ideas why this is happening?
I really think it's a hesitancy to make a commitment to say, here, I'm going to show up every week, whatever it might be. I don't want to commit because they might ask me to be an officer in this organization. They want to be a part, but yet they just don't want to make a commitment.
The explosion of online social media.
That's what I think is more. I think we've got other things we can do. We don't have to go. And, you know, sometimes being around other people is just not a pleasant thing. It's a lot easier just to sit at our computer and do what we're going to do. Or, you know, join online organizations where we, again, you don't even know what the person looks like. You don't even know how old they are. I mean, they can claim to be a certain age, but you just don't know at all. So, so that's one of the things. And actually, when he was writing about Bowling Alone, that's a thing that you know is exploded since he wrote that book. Go ahead.
I teach at a small college, and I was trying to test the waters. I thought there would be a lot of interest in this, having just a teacher's lounge, because we don't have one, where people can go and sit and have a cup of coffee, and you know, ideas would just incubate. People would talk about what they were doing. People had a natural inclination to want to talk about their craft. And I met complete apathy, almost complete apathy. And when I ask people, when I really press people, they say, well, people won't come to that place. It's across the street. They won't get out of their desk and cross the street to come to some place. And I was just mind-boggled. I thought to myself, isn't the human condition to be, they call humans a social animal. What, if we have social
that was Aristotle.
Where does it come, why doesn't it hurt us enough
You know, and people communicate very differently. I get a lot of people who listen to talk radio or to other things where people are very hostile, and then they go, and it's not the way people normally talk. I mean, if you turn on the radio, people just do not talk like, people don't talk like Mark Belling. I mean, he has these long gaps, it's very hostile, and it's entertaining, but it's not the way we normally talk to one another. So I get a lot of emails. There are days when I get 100, 150 emails from people. And I did a stupid thing last year, which which was have a resolution I would respond to all emails. And that was like, you know, about January 15th, I'm like, man, that was stupid. I was staying at work generally on Fridays from like 8 o'clock until 2 or 3 in the morning answering emails. And Sonia was like, this is really, really stupid. She agreed with me. People would say things in emails that they would never say to me face to face. So I frequently will look up people and call them at home and say, you just left me a message saying these things to me. People dropping the N-word, people dropping all sorts of words. And it's funny, people, they are embarrassed when I call and say, you know, here's your chance, you're talking to me on the phone, tell me what you think. And you know, the most amazing have been some people who say, okay, I can't believe you called me, I'll renew my subscription. I'm not telling you to do that, I'm just telling you, because people respond and talk very differently to one another instead of by email. The other one's the loss of faith in institutions, as we've discussed. Consumer approach to faith, which is, if, you know, a long time ago, if you went to your parish, the church in the parish, and if you didn't like the pastor, that's too bad, that's where you went. Now, if you didn't like the sermon today, you can stay home next week, you can go some other place, you can go next door, you can go anywhere you want to.
You don't need to tell them that.
I think they figured that out. And another one is a sense of hyper-individualism. So, some of you alluded to this. There was a book in 1985 called Habits of the Heart by a guy named Robert Bellah, and he was studying how people in America live, and he was thinking also about this de Tocqueville idea about voluntary associations, and he was finding, even in 1985, a lot of people who were staying home and being spiritual without associating with a religion. And he came across a woman named Sheila who referred to her religion as Sheilaism. And this became a very important concept in sociology, it still is today, that many of us, instead of going to church and adopting the ideas that, or what you've learned, and you know, you hear that all the time. Someone brought that up when we were talking about the Bible a couple weeks ago. They're like, but I learned in confirmation this about the Bible. Well, you know, more and more of us are sort of creating our own religion as we go along. And then someone mentioned the college problem, which is we learn things as youngsters, but then when we get to college, we're challenged. And I mentioned the term biblicism, which is the belief that the Bible is without many or major mistakes, or that most of it happened pretty much as you know, as is explained. And then we get to college, and some of that stuff, there's a crisis of faith. How do we deal with that? And you know, I've thought more and more of my kids, how I'm going to deal with that, because my son, who's a sophomore in college, ran into that, and he was like, well, you know, this isn't exactly the way I expected it to be. I'm going to play just a brief excerpt now from a guy named Marcus Borg, just talking about this crisis that goes on.
Vital resource in the life of congregations and in the life of Christian individuals is one of the most important tasks for mainline congregations today. And that's because many of us in the mainline grew up with an understanding of the Bible that stopped making sense to us at some point. And this understanding that stopped making sense to many of us is a literalistic understanding, either in hard form or soft form. Now, the hard form of biblical literalism is the insistence that everything the Bible says is the absolute will of God, and that if it says something happened, then that thing really happened. So it's very much concerned with factuality as well. And at some point, for most of us in mainline churches, that understanding of the Bible that we acquired as children simply stopped being persuasive to us. Shorthand for that understanding of the Bible, of course, is biblical literalism. And again, it exists in both harder and softer forms. So one of the main tasks for congregations today is to do adult theological re-education about the Bible. And this will concern, above all, the three questions of the Bible's origin, its authority, and its interpretation. For an earlier way of looking at the...
Stop it there. Actually, I mean, that's going on here. Pastor Marty's doing a lot of stuff like that, and many of us are doing this on Sunday mornings. Did anyone here have that as an issue when they got to college, and you run into what you grew up and what you believed, and then bam? Yeah. And for me, growing up in a fundamentalist family, it wasn't just the literal statements about that. One of the biggest problems I had was meeting people that I didn't meet before. I knew Jews theoretically, but I didn't know any Jews personally. In my very first job, I'm put on a beat with a Jewish guy, and you know, it was an interesting experience. And to meet Muslims and Sikhs like last week, it changes the way you think about other people, and it's harder to condemn that person. So I asked you this question: why be religious? And some of you given your reasons. And you know, this past week I was just thinking about this. You know, you looked at that crowd and the number of people who were there at the announcement with the Pope, and that is, we dislike our institutions except when someone wants to shut it down, whether it's a school or there was a story on the post offices. They want to shut down post offices, and people are talking about doing sit-ins at post offices. It's just a hilarious thing to me. It's a post office. I know it's been there for 80 years. It's got WPA art and all that sort of stuff. So I mean, we do care about. It's the opposite of the NIMBY. Instead of not in our backyard, the ones that are in our backyard are the ones that we care about the most. And then that is when I've talked to you about a mission trip. I went on the mission trip. I don't look very excited about it, but I went with, this is my third mission trip I've gone on. And when we were in New Orleans this most recent time, I was with my daughter who's 16, she was 15 at the time. And there was, on the ceilings, people had painted the groups that had been there. And I asked her, I said, look, what people have been here to do what we're doing today? And there were two groups. There were church groups and college groups, frats and sororities. I don't mean to say that those are the two most, you know, spiritual groups or anything like that, but it was interesting. It was groups of people who were doing this thing. It's like soup kitchens. Who runs soup kitchens? No one runs a soup kitchen out of the back of their house. No one does a homeless shelter. It's groups. It's people coming together and making decisions collectively. Some of my best friends are atheists, agnostics. My best friend is agnostic, but there were no agnostic groups that were down in New Orleans painting these houses and doing things so selflessly as that. And it sort of compels you and moves you when you're in a congregation to consider options about helping other people. So I don't have a real term for this. I'd say it's one body, many parts, the body of Christ. But you know, the funny thing is too, that when we talk about the Word of God, many of us expect it to be clean and pure and without mistakes. But when we talk about the body of Christ, no one expects that to be clean and pure and without mistakes. And I think in both cases, there are flaws within it because God doesn't deal with us directly. He does it through people. He mediates through people, through, I mean, even communion, that's through objects, physical objects. That's a basic part of Lutheran theology. God uses wine and he uses bread, and that's how his grace comes down to us. So you know, it was interesting when we were thinking about it, and Rainey was, my daughter Rainey, she was like, there's got to be other groups, and we went through, and it just wasn't the case. There aren't other groups that are involved in doing that stuff. And then another reason to, and I didn't intend this to become an advertisement for going to church, but one reason for doing religion as opposed to just doing spirituality is it's not just you sitting at home coming up with your own religion. You are actually engaged with other people, other thinkers, and other traditions. You're coming across not just people here and now, but we read the Nicene Creed. We are encountering 2,000 years of thinking about and experiencing who God is. So I'm going to read just a section. Well, actually, I'll show a video of, this is a minister in suburban Chicago talking about some of these ideas.
The First Congregational Church in Glen Ellen, Illinois, an upscale suburb of Chicago, Lillian Daniel is the senior minister. She says she's had enough of outsiders who bash the church and of church people who don't protest. So she's pushing back herself. In a new book, in articles, and in sermons she preaches as a guest minister around the country. At Howard University in Washington, D.C. recently, Daniel railed at writers and others who she says have blamed the church for many of the world's biggest problems.
What church community are you describing? Because it is not mine. And how dare you presume to paint me with that broad and offensive brush? So why is it that when the spiritual but not religious complain about Christianity, why don't we get mad? Why don't we tell them a different story of a progressive church where your questions are welcomed, where we worship a God who invented us and not the other way around?
Daniel's audience included the dean of the Howard Chapel and Howard's president and his wife. She referred to them when she acknowledged her own part in what she calls America's culture of narcissism.
In which it is so easy to think it is all about me. So much so that when the dean told me quietly that the president and first lady were here today, you know where my mind went. I'm from Chicago. I said, Barack and Michelle here?
But
I'm going to actually read a section from her first essay. This is the book that she was referring to. The first chapter is called Spiritual But Not Religious. A man recently told me something about his faith life, as people are wont to do with ministers. He said, I'm spiritual but not religious, and I want to give you my testimony, if you will, about why I do not attend church. Now, can I just vent for a minute? When I met a teacher, I didn't feel the need to tell him that I always hated math. When I meet a chef, I don't need to tell her that I can't cook. When I meet a clown, I don't need to tell him that I think clowns are all scary. No, I keep that stuff to myself, but everybody loves to tell a minister what's wrong with the church. And it's usually some church that bears no relation to the one I'm proud to serve. So I braced myself. Like so many Americans, he had made many stops in the new religious marketplace, that consumer idea that I was talking about, where no one has to stay in the tradition they were born in. Today, Americans shop for churches. I've moved from one church to another, and some of you have too. So he was raised in the Catholic Church. He came to feel injured by that tradition, let down by it. His questions weren't answered or welcomed. The worship, the ritual, the preaching, it all felt pretty irrelevant. So later after college, he was drawn as a young adult into a conservative Baptist church. He had joined that church because of the great people and even accepted Christ as his personal Savior during a service. But later, after joining, he realized the church held all sorts of strict beliefs he could not contend with. The worst of which was the prohibition on dancing, not to mention a prohibition on sex before marriage. Later, after marrying, he joined the church of his wife's upbringing, an open-minded liberal Protestant church in my own denomination, a church he described as a big warm hug. There, dancing and drinking were not frowned upon, and neither were his theological questions. In that intellectual environment, he was encouraged to use his mind to think about the biblical narrative, and on and on. He ends up getting divorced, and so he ends up leaving. He dumped the news in my lap as if it were a controversial hot potato, something that would shock a mild-mannered minister never before exposed to ideas so brave and different and daring. But of course, to me, none of this was different in the least. This kind and well-meaning Sunday jogger fits right into the mainstream American culture. is perhaps by now in the majority, all those people who've stepped away from the church in favor of what? Running, newspaper reading, again, not a bad thing, Sunday yoga, or whatever they put together to construct a more convenient religion of their own making. I was not shocked or upset by the man's story. Naturally, I'd heard it a million times before, so often that I almost thought I should improvise the plot line along with him. Let me guess. You read the New York Times every Sunday, cover to cover, and you get more out of it than the sermon. Let me guess. You expect where you exercise it, and where do you find God? Nature and the trees. It's always the trees during a long hike, a long run, a walk on the beach. And don't forget the sunset. These people always want to tell you that God is in the sunset. Like people who attend church wouldn't know that. Like we're these monkish people who have never heard any of these things. They've never heard these Old Testament psalms that praise God in the beauty of natural creation. Like we never leave the church building. God in nature, really? It's all over the Bible. That we've heard every Sunday, but these folks don't seem to think that they've invented it. But push a little harder on this self-developed religion, and you don't get much, at least much depth. So you find God in the sunset? Great, so do I. But how about in the face of cancer? Cancer is nature too. Do you worship that as well? It's a pretty good essay, and the rest of the book's pretty interesting. There's one other thing that I wanted to tell you, which actually I was a little bit surprised. I had no idea that this was the case with the spiritual but not religious. And that is, I told you in Europe, this is a much more developed concept, and some people think we're headed in that direction. And that is, this is a website called Religious Dispatches, and that is people who are spiritual but not religious have way more mental disorders than people who attend church regularly. And again, I'm not saying that there's a causal connection between the two, but it's interesting. In the British study, SBNRs were found to be significantly more likely to be drug dependent and to suffer from phobias or anxiety. And then this person wrote, no wonder they're significantly more likely than the religious to be treated with psychotropic drugs. But you know, it's actually, the possibility is that it's harder for you to fit into a church environment if you are struggling with those problems. When I first started coming here, Sonia, my wife, had cancer. We were in a cancer support group, and one of the people in the group had a spouse die, and he had a very hard time coming back to church. His point was, everybody here is happy and expects you to be happy, and he found it difficult to come here and expect that, and so over time he eventually quit coming to church. And that's the final point I want to make. You know, the church, as I said, is not a perfect thing. There are a number of problems with it. Anybody who served on a church committee knows how difficult other Christians can be. And pastors know this as well. That's the end of my talk. Does anyone else, do you have any questions about this? Have you guys run into this before, this concept of spiritual but not religious? You mentioned that you knew somebody. Does anyone else here know somebody, someone who would fit? Well, the point is, I think some of the criticism is very, very legitimate about the hypocrisy, about the problems, about a number of the things. But at the same time, it's not like the only alternative is to drop out, or as Bishop Spong likes to refer to it, the Christian Alumni Association. Someone had a book. Who brought the book that they wanted to share?
I brought the Christianity After Religion by Dan and Butler Bass. And if anybody wants to borrow to read this book, I will lend it to them. It's a wonderful book, and this kind of expounds a little more deeply in a variety of areas that Dan just touched on, about where we are, where we were, where we are, and where she thinks we're going. And she's talking about a renewal, like an opportunity for Christianity and for churches to flourish in a new way in which we haven't thought about it. And with Christ at the center of it. So it's a really, really excellent read.
She was the one in the very first video talking about Christianity without the church.
Before I read it, I worked with a variety of churches in the area, 3 different churches. And some of this was discussed, these issues that we're talking about. And Pastor Fran Odden walked up to me last April and said, I just finished reading this book, you should read this. Because I had a sense of, there's no hope. We're dying. And when I read the book, I got the sense that she was telling me that we're dying also, and where are we going to go?
Well, you know, it is an interesting thing. As I told you, the younger you are, the less likely you feel an attachment to a religion, a denomination, or to a particular faith tradition. And the church has to think about how it responds to that. We educate people up to the year 18, and then they disappear until they have kids.
The interesting part about this, though, the way she takes it, is that we are renewed in our relationship with Christ through God's grace, and she sees an incredible renewal starting to happen in our churches. So it kind of challenges where we came from and where we are, but then provides a very interesting approach to where she sees us going with Christ.
You know, every time I teach a class like this, I am amazed that we have as many people here, because I remember coming here for the first time I went to an adult education class here in the late 90s, and there were 5 of us in the class, and that was it. But people are interested, and they will come and listen to things that are interesting, different, new, and I mean, so it's again, people may not be religious, but they are spiritually interested. So, last thing, and then
I was going to say, back in the 60s with the whole anti-institutional thing, and Bella came along with the cut flower generation, that folks were leaving and not being nurtured and really to ask the deeper questions to deal with the crisis of life. But I think it's to a larger extent today than it was then, even in the 60s. That's my sense. And I think Facebook, where you are in connection with people from your church home all week long instead of waiting for Sunday to meet them again, has some impact on the decline. I really do this technology.
okay. Well, thank you. If you want to talk, I'll hang around afterwards for a while.